is only 10 minutes. All right, here we go. Excuse me.
Hello, well.
And actually, I'm going to start over again. All right. All right. So, hey guys, we are watching another video today. World building fantasy technology, writing advice from a fantasy author. I really just recently found this guy. This is Stephen, or it might be pronounced Stefan. I'm not sure how he pronounces it. I'm sorry. Aryan. Maybe. We'll see if he pronounces his name on this show for me. I've only seen like 2 of his videos, but I really liked both of those videos. So I want to start watching some of his videos with you guys, because I like the way that he talked. I like the way that he presented himself. So we're gonna give him some time here and see what he has to say about writing technology for fantasy world building.
Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we're doing another video on fantasy world building, and we're talking about technology. How far can you go with your technology before it becomes science fiction? Yeah. What level of technology do you want to introduce? And what...
To a certain degree, I get that there is supposed to be like a clear, like, you know, Webster's dictionary type of distinction between fantasy and science fiction, but I just feel like they're so close. They're really so close, and they get mingled so much now too. Like, people are like, you know, like with steampunk, for instance. Steampunk is such a mix, right? Like, it's just one of those things where I don't know where you really draw the line sometimes. I think that you can really stretch the line too. You can really push that boundary of where you're still in fantasy or you're really still in sci-fi, even though you're really dipping into the other. So yeah, I'm not really sure where the line is sometimes.
What kinds of technology? If you look back through history of Earth, we have different ages, whether it's the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and so on. And this refers to what they were crafting tools and weapons from. I haven't seen a fantasy book with a Stone Age level of technology. Most fantasy books have steel weapons. This is just something that's quite common. There's no reason you couldn't have some kind of a Bronze Age thing. There are pros and cons, obviously. It means that the technology isn't nearly as advanced. The society isn't nearly as advanced, and their understanding of how it works, therefore, is a bit limited compared to what we'd look at today. So moving the story slightly closer to...
There is some evidence out there that I can't really cite because I don't remember where exactly I heard it, but, you know, scientists, doctors, all that kind of shit, where they are saying a lot that basically a lot of civilizations like the Roman, the Egyptian, they just kind of sprung up in a sense, you know, and also in China too, they just kind of sprung up where they were kind of like primitive, and then suddenly boom, they're you know, they're rocking and rolling with steel almost, right? They're like, they just really jump. And what a lot of them are suggesting is really more of that they knew how to do the thing, but they just didn't have the thing. So basically it's kind of like it reminded me of like the idea of Minecraft. It's like, well, I know how to make a steel sword. I just don't have any steel yet, and I don't have the basic tools to actually go get the steel kind of thing, right? So I need to chop down trees. I'll get some rocks, and I'll make a stone axe. I can chop down more trees now faster than punching it with my hand kind of thing, right? And then I can make some pickaxes out of stone, and then I can go down and I can start cutting into the earth, and I can start picking out some iron and some coal and whatever else kind of thing, right? And basically it's like they knew how to do it. They just did not have the ability to do it. And that's why a lot of times these jumps would happen very rapidly, because it's like as soon as we were able to do it, then we were just able to like snowball the effect. Okay, we have iron. Well, we know how to make iron tools. We just needed the iron beforehand, and now we also know how to get the heat correct. We just needed the tools to make the heat correct. We knew what degree or temperature we needed to get to, and now we can make it. So now that we can, we're gonna make more tools that will allow us to get more of this shit, and then go back and get more of that shit, and then we can start making like swords and all the other stuff and walls and things. So there is that that hypothesis out there that we were smart, that it wasn't really a lack of understanding, that it was more of just a lack of having those tools.
Something that's more familiar to people can make it a little bit easier to understand, but there's no reason you couldn't have something that's set a bit more basic in terms of the technology level. Moving away from weapons, let's look at something else. How about books? In fantasy books, you often have scribes, people writing messages, and then some kind of transport system perhaps for getting messages around. But then you think about books. Are they all being handwritten? Why can't there be some level of technology where they've invented the printing press? Have they moved technology onto that level that mechanization has taken place? Joe Abercrombie's new series at the moment, The Age of Madness, set within the first law world. The society is going through an industrial revolution. There are factories producing huge amounts of technology and weapons and cannons on a scale that the world has never seen before. There are printing presses producing flyers and books. That level of technology has an enormous impact on society. In his book and in other books with that level of technology, you have different tiers of society. There's the rich who are making lots of money by exploiting the poor, paying them poor wages, poor living conditions to produce the stuff in huge numbers that they then sell on for enormous amounts of profit. With Industrial Revolution, of course, there's an impact on society, where there's the food, there's the environment, muddying the waters, poisoning the water systems, all of this kind of stuff that feeds into it. Things that we wouldn't do now. We can look back at our history and say, oh, that's disgusting, poison the lakes and the rivers when pouring sewage raw into the sea and that sort of stuff. You're not even treating it. But within a fantasy world, they wouldn't understand that level of stuff. So why wouldn't they do it? Then you move forward into warfare and you think about what level of technology do they have? Do they have cannons, or is it something a bit more basic? Do they have huge catapults and trebuchets and siege engines for that sort of stuff? I've talked about architecture and cities in a previous video, but equally, what are they building their towns and cities from? What level of defence do they have? Is it just wooden palisades? Do they understand quarrying stone? Do they have massive walls to defend their cities? And therefore, if you're trying to lay siege to that city, what kind of technologies does the opposing force have to try and get inside? Another subsection of the fantasy genre is sometimes referred to as flintlock fantasy. This could be the books of Brian McClellan or Adrian Tchaikovsky with his Guns of the Dawn. And this is people who have the basic understanding of things like muskets and rifles and gunpowder. Maybe they've moved on to cannons as well, maybe they haven't. But there are still people with swords and shields, but now you have projectile weapons that are better than a basic bow and arrow, that are more dangerous and more lethal over long distances. This is another area that few people have dabbled with and done some great series in. The next thing to think about is, where does magic sit within this world that you've created in terms of technology?
Yeah, that's the big
How
one.
developed is the technology? Is it basic swords and shields and steel weapons? Is it something more primitive? Have you advanced to some kind of technology that's with flintlocks and cannons and siege engines? And against all that, if there is magic in your world, how does it hold up? How does it compare? Is it an opposing force? Does it work in parallel with it? As I mentioned, the Brian McClellan novels, he has magic within that world where it works in parallel. Some people combine technology with magic and it has unique and interesting effects, which I won't spoil, but he's done something a bit different. that I hadn't seen before. Another way.
Yeah, that's one thing I would say about like with my book is that I kind of looked at mages and magic as kind of like the science. So they are they're like the PhDs of the world, right? So all the mages are very highly educated in comparison to the masses. They some people who they don't have a lot of magic, they don't have like a lot of control over higher end magic. They just do very like oh, the tailor is able to have he's able to stitch with his hand, but then he's also able to have like another needle and thread going by itself kind of thing. So maybe he can do that, or he can at least like float the material over to him and lay it down, so it just enhances his life a little bit. So there are like people on the low end like that, while other people on the higher end of magic are like pushing the boundaries. Like they're really trying to find out what they can really do with this stuff, right? And that's one of the reasons why in my world they're basically on the cusp of making cannons. Is what is kind of where they are. They like right now, in the very beginning of the book series, ships are not outfitted with cannons. They are later on in the book series, and guns like like he said, flintlocks, stuff like that. They do become a thing later on in the book series. But the reason that these things are held back so much from like what we would consider our normal time period, and to where they are in like other aspects of technology, is because mages kind of filled that space. Before, you didn't need to have cannons on your ship because you could just hire a couple of mages. And so if there's anyone out there who wants to be a pirate and come up and try to take your ship, well, if you have 2 mages, it's game over. If you have 1 mage, it's probably game over, right? So you just hire a mage to be on your ship with you, hire a couple mages for a bigger ship maybe, and that's all you needed. You didn't need to have there was no pressing concern to have a range weapon on a ship. You know what I mean? So therefore, the idea and the need for cannons on ships was suppressed. It wasn't needed. Same thing with with other like trebuchets and ballistae. They were also held back because they weren't as needed either. But civilizations that didn't have mages as much, so for instance like the dwarves, they don't have mages. When they needed to come out of their mountain and attack, they were the ones who invented the ballistae, for instance, in my world, because they didn't really think height because of how tall their mountain is. They were thinking more horizontal, I guess, rather than vertical. So they made ballistae, and that's where that came from. It's because they didn't have a magical option like humans did and like the elves did. So that's one of the things that I have thought of is, where does magic really come into the world? How has it affected the world's growth? Like, where a lot of times we think about magic, we always think about like, oh, it would advance things a lot faster. But actually, if you really think about it, it would advance things because in the example of needing a cannon on a ship, we've already got cannons. We don't need to make up cannons. We already have living human cannons, right? So we don't need cannons. But that means that we're going to suppress the invention of cannons, which means we're going to suppress the need for like developing gunpowder and such, blasting powder, and therefore, handguns and muskets and such, they're also going to be repressed, to where they don't show up for several hundred years when they would have without the mages, kind of thing. So it's kind of a give and take. They do advance in some ways, and they also redact in other ways.
Way to look at it is the Shadows of the Apt series, which is a 10-book series by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, he has some technology and some basic flying machines that are quite primitive, but he also has racial magic systems. This is where every race has an inherent ability or talent that gives them something unique. And all of the races within this world, it isn't a spoiler, it's part of the basic setup, is based upon a particular insect. They're called the kindon. So for example, there are the beetles. These are very industrial. They're all humanoid looking people. The beetle kindon are very industrious. They're very good at technology. They're very good at working out things and putting things together and building basic machines. Then you have the mantis kindon. These are people who are great warriors. They have kind of bony spurs that come out of their forearms, which is another level of technology that's inherent to them. There's the ant kindon, who, as you would expect, live in these huge kind of groups. However, they have essentially what is a hive mind, and they can communicate telepathically with each other. And you can't replicate that in most fantasy worlds with basic technology. It borders on the supernatural or the fantastical in nature. And that's a kind of a technology that, if you're starting down the normal industrial revolution level, you'd never have thought of, because it doesn't follow the kind of basic tracks.
Yeah.
So where the technology blurs how it fits together with magic within your fantasy world, are they opposing forces? Do they work together? Is one rising and the other falling? What's happening within your world? And then think about all of the knock-on effects of that on society. History books are filled with examples of societies changing as new technologies are brought in. Some people are kicking and screaming.
Watch, I'm going to say real fast. That's an interesting thought process too, about having basically of kind of like, are they rising or falling, right? That is pretty interesting, because of the fact that a lot of times in fantasy we don't really think of magic as like on the downslope, right? While technology is on the upswing, because usually we want our magic to be very fantastical, very amazing, like, oh my gosh, this magic is so great. But that is actually kind of interesting to think of, like, well, if I had a magic system and it had kind of like a hard cap to it, in some degree, where maybe the magic system is really kind of like fireballs and magic shields, and so they're very powerful cannons and they're very powerful shields, but now we're starting to get into guns, and so the shields don't last as long. We have other projectiles, cannons and guns that can kind of replicate to a certain degree the same thing as a fireball. So we're starting to match the magic system in the world, and so therefore it's kind of capped out, while this still has room to grow possibly. So that's kind of an interesting thought.
History books are filled with examples of societies changing as new technologies are brought in. Some people are kicking and screaming and don't want it and reject it. Some go along with it willingly. This creates conflict, civils, wars, all sorts of problems. And you can look at history books for some great ideas and great examples. As I mentioned in the Joe Abercrombie books, he has magic within his fantasy worlds. That's not a spoiler. But suddenly you've got the power of industrialization for warfare. So what happens then? What happens to the people, and what's the use of magic if you suddenly can produce cannons that can kill people from much further away in greater numbers? How does that change warfare? How does that change society? What does it mean? Where do they go from there? Some great questions and great ideas to raise that he's based, very loosely on other things that we've seen in the past, but it's completely set within his own fantasy world, and he's taking it in his own direction. In a previous video, I spoke about the Draconis Memoriam series by Anthony Ryan, and he has kind of steamships. That's another level of something of technology, perhaps, with industrialization. Transport is a great thing to think about, whether it's flying machines or ships or boats or some kind of mechanized boat. Do you have that within your fantasy world? Who's invented it? Who came up with it? Where did it come from? How long has it been in service? Is it something that's completely new that people are just getting used to for the first time? Because every time a new technology is introduced in our world, it takes a bit of time for people to get used to it.
Yeah.
And
I also would ask, like, who's really funding that, right? Who's really funding that research? So, like, again, in my world, the mages, because they are so powerful, they have a lot of the money, a lot of the world's like currency flows through them, basically, right? They're hired to do a lot of things, a lot of mundane things as well, that aren't like going out and killing monsters or whatever kind of thing too. or building structures very fast because they can use levitation and whatever else kind of stuff. So there's a lot of jobs that they fill throughout the entire day, and therefore, or the entire world, excuse me. And so therefore, a lot of the money is kind of flowed through them, right? So the people who are on top of the Mages Guild, they have a vast amount of power in that regard. So when it comes to like who is funding things, who is backing these projects, someone, kind of going back to my example of like cannons, right? It's kind of like, someone might have the idea for a cannon and then go, hey, it might go to like a lord or lady and say, hey, you have a lot of ships that travel a lot of goods, or traffic a lot of goods over the ocean, and I had this idea for these cannons that can shoot out these heavy iron balls at the target, and that way you don't have to hire mages all the time. You can just basically buy these things, buy like one or two of them, and then you're set to go. Right, now you're good, right, forever. And that lord or lady would kind of think, well, I do get charged X amount of gold per mage, but at the same time, I do have like a deal with the mages. Like, I'm not just hiring them to be my ship's bodyguards. I'm also hiring them to build me another ship. I'm also hiring them to, be my land bodyguards. I'm also hiring them to, go out on quests to fetch magical items for me. Like I have a lot of business with the Mages Guild. So if I started like replacing them with these cannons that you say would work, which I don't know if they would work. I've never seen them work before. If I'm replacing them there, then I might end up I might mess up my deals with them, so I don't really want to put money behind that, right? So that's another one of those things where you have to think about like who's really funding the technology, right? Is it king, queen, lord or lady? Is it some third party like the Merchants Guild is doing this? Is it who's really thinking of these other alternatives when they have an already proven answer in the Mages Guild kind of thing, in the magic system? So that's one of the things that you would want to think of too, I think.
Some there again push back against it. Think about mobile phones now. They're everywhere. Most people that you probably know have one. But you go back only 40 years and they didn't exist. How has society changed with that now? Not just the 24-hour news cycle, but the fact that everybody can be connected at all times. You can look up anything on your phone and find the answer through the internet. You might be watching this video now or listening to it on your phone. That wasn't possible a long time ago. Instant communication around the world. Something like that on a very different level could exist within your fantasy world. Some radical new technology comes in, upsets the entire balance. There are so many different types of technology, whether it's transport, communications, weaponry. It's going to take a long time to explore. And as ever with this video, the goal is not to provide all of the answers. The goal is to raise lots of questions and get you thinking about this area. What level of technology do you have in your fantasy world? Do you have any? How far does it go? What is the impact on society? And where does it fit with everything else that you've created to create this cohesive fantasy world that feels realistic for the reader? So it's just another element to think about when you're building it. But as ever, don't spend too long building the world. Get on with the writing of it. So that's it for today, but I'll be back soon with another video.
Good video. I like that one. And he's right. That's a good thing to do too, is like just to have these questions. A lot of times we watch these videos on writing and they're like, they give like general tips of how to, rather than just asking you like to think about it, right? I mean, that's the biggest part about being a writer is, making it up yourself, right? Like I see on Reddit sometimes where they ask questions of like, I remember one of them was like, how do I have my hero close the sky portal when it's in the sky? I don't know. It's your story. I have no idea how they do it. You figure that out, you know? That I feel like a lot of people want to be told how to write, but you know, that's another subject. This video here, I think it's a good way to kind of get your mind thinking, and also too kind of demonstrates how deep world building can really get when you kind of need to be that deep. You know, I feel like a lot of times people don't go deep enough. Like you have the old iceberg example where you have basically, you know, there's a surface layer of water, you have the iceberg, and that's what everyone can see. And then you have this under the water portion, which is kind of like, I guess, what everyone suspects or something like that. Oh, this is what's in your book. This is what you know under the water. And then down below is what people think that you know or something. I forget how the exact metaphor goes. But basically it's kind of like you don't really need the entire iceberg. You can make do with just having most of it. But people don't go down deep enough sometimes, I feel. They kind of think, you know, like, well, who's the ruler? What type of money do they use? They don't really think about, like, how is money really generated? That's a very rabbit hole-y subject, right? You can really get lost in the rabbit hole of how money gets generated throughout history, right? Not just in our current facet of how money is generated, but like having to figure out how money was generated back in the past. You just kind of think like, oh, well, people, did services or produced goods and people paid for it, the end. And in a lot of cases that's true, but that's not always true. But in particular to this one, you know, how is magic really affecting my world beyond just the battlefield, right? Beyond just the flashy fireballs and arcane shields and teleporting around, whatever, right? How are they taking the spells and using them? I think I did a video on this as well, where you have the idea of peacetime versus wartime. And in wartime, a lot of the mages are going to be focusing on their spellcraft, like making new spells up that will deal with the current enemy, right? Hey guys, it's an ice giant, horde, right? It's just a bunch of ice giants. Well, we need to figure out how to get the largest amount of firepower. So we're going to do fire spells. The largest fire spell for the least amount of mana. How do we do that, right? Whatever the cost, however you make your cost up, right? How do we get the largest amount of fire, since they're going to be weak to fire? How do we do that, right? You know, whatever the enemy is, whatever challenge the enemy is producing, they're going to be making spells up that reflect that and counter that enemy, right? But in peace times, they're going to be trying to think of ways to make magic enhance the lives of the people around them, just the way scientists do. Scientists do the exact same thing, where they're constantly trying to make life easier and better for the people around them, right? And then again, it comes back to who's actually funding this technology, who's funding this research and development kind of thing. So those are a lot of good questions to really ask yourself when you're making your fantasy world, and when you're building your magic system along with technology in mind. All right, so we're gonna like that video, and we're gonna move on to the next one.